battles forward in a Herculean effort to simply stay on track. Waves rear up to towering heights and pound the ship's steel shell, rattling it, shuddering the deck beneath the crew's feet. The wind rips the tops off the waves and it showers the vessel with huge sheets of spray. It's November 1975, and the Edmund Fitzgerald is fighting for its life. On the bridge, Captain Ernest McSorley watches aghast at the conditions he's facing. This is the worst blow he's ever seen, and he and his ship have been fighting it for almost an entire day. Just a few hours ago, the massive weight of water had ripped away 2 vents and a railing, and roared down into the ballast tanks below. Now his ship sits at an awkward angle, listing to the side as she rolls and pitches like a toy in the churning water. 29 men are aboard, but none of them will survive the night. Edmund Fitzgerald will transmit her final message at 7:10 that night. "We are holding our own," she would report. But then, silence. The Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared into the murk. Six months later, there came a tragic sight. The shattered hulk of the ship torn apart 530 feet, 160 metres deep on the frigid lake bottom. When she'd first been introduced, the Edmund Fitzgerald had been the biggest ship on the Great Lakes, a record-breaking workhorse of a vessel that was a familiar and popular sight up and down from Toledo and Lake Erie up to Detroit and Lake St. Clair, Huron, the Sioux Locks and Lake Superior. She was a giant, fairly modern, just 16 years old, and comfortable. But her destruction came completely out of the blue. Just what had caused the Queen of the Lakes to tear apart and sink without ever issuing a distress call? To this day, experts debate the cause of her loss, and everything has been called into question. Her design, the quality of construction, the standards of maintenance, the operations of the ship, and the freak forces of nature that could have broken her apart. But Edmund Fitzgerald is far from the only ship to suffer such a tragic, violent fate. Many others came before it, from the Lakers and freighters that tore apart in storms, to the big merchant ship that was pummeled into submission and sunk by a horror typhoon. Today, in 2025, 50 years after the great ship was lost, we're going to wind back the clock. We'll re-examine the chain of events that led to the violent sinking, then analyse the state of the wreck and other similar disasters to create our best hypothesis on what actually sent the ship to her doom. These other wrecks give us invaluable clues into the loss of the mighty Fitz, and one in particular may just help solve the mystery 5 decades after the once Queen of the Lakes was lost. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the story of what could have sunk the Edmund Fitzgerald. Lake Superior, 160 miles or 260 kilometers wide, and about double that in length. A monstrous, ancient body of water, 1,300 feet or 406 meters deep in parts. It was birthed by melting glaciers that once stood over a mile tall. Their retreat filled a basin, carved out by the gargantuan drifting of the continents themselves. The lake, really a vast inland sea, commands and deserves respect. It has sent untold numbers of ships and their crews to their graves, with many having simply disappeared. It's so cold year-round that bodies don't decay and float like they might do in the ocean. They simply drop into the abyss, never to be seen again. The storms that whip it into white, raging fury are legendary, and that November in 1975 was shaping up to be a typically violent one. On the 8th, over the Oklahoma Panhandle, a storm system was born that began to gradually creep upward. The National Weather Service tracked it closely as it slowly rolled up over Kansas. They predicted it would lumber south of Lake Superior sometime on the night of the 10th. number 1, Superior, Wisconsin. 8:30 a.m. on the 9th of November saw a flurry of activity as the Edmund Fitzgerald was loaded with ton after ton of iron ore pellet. The Edmund Fitzgerald, known as the Mighty Fitz and the Toledo Express, was a special ship. She'd been paid for and commissioned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company out of Milwaukee, who'd invested in the burgeoning iron and minerals industry. Designed to be as big as practicable, the ship had to be as large as it could actually fit through the many locks and rivers that link the Great Lakes together. Ultimately, she still had to fit within the St. Lawrence Seaway, giving her a length of 729 feet, it's about 222 metres, and a beam, or width, of 75 feet, or 23 metres. In the summer of 1958, the massive ship had thundered sideways down the slip. The name, Edmund Fitzgerald, had come from her parent company's president, who had actually balked at the idea of having a vessel named after him. Still, she proudly wore his name at the front of her immense, slender red hull. She was an example of a straight decker, a kind of cargo ship and ore carrier common on the lakes, even today, with 2 distinct islands forward and aft, separated by hundreds of feet of cargo holds down the centre of the ship. The forward tower held accommodations in the pilot house, which included the chart room and the navigation bridge, the nerve centre of the ship, while aft, towards the stern, sat the second tower, with more accommodations and crew mess spaces, and a galley. On her spar, or weather deck, sat no fewer than 21 cargo hatches, which, with their covers removed, revealed deep shafts reaching well down into the cavernous holds of the ship. For despite her huge length and volume, the hull of the Edmund Fitzgerald was really just an empty shell, capable of loading in excess of 26,000 long tons of cargo. The holds were enormous. Number 1, just aft of the pilot house, number 2, amidships, and number 3, towards the stern, butting up against the engine room. The hatch covers had to be unlashed and lifted off using electric cranes, and they were simply enormous. Not square, like on many passenger ships, but rectangular, spanning almost the full breadth of the ship's 75-foot beam. They were held in place with 68 hand-adjusted clamps, which, when tightened down, bit on the gasket and sealed the hatch shut. A stroll down the spar deck would allow the crew to walk from the pilot house to the after tower and the mess, but in bad weather, the experience could be miserable, if not dangerous. Instead, a pair of tunnels ran to port and starboard of the holds and allowed easy underground access, as it were. Finally, to give the crew critical control over their ship's stability at sea, some 16 ballast tanks, 8 per side, flanked the holds and protected her flanks and underside from collisions, grounding, and scraping damage. She was a ship designed to efficiently and effectively haul tens of thousands of tons of deadweight over long distances, and she excelled at her task. For 16 years, the Mighty Fitz steamed over 1 million miles through the lakes, over nearly 750 round trips. That Sunday, November 9th, saw the ship loading taconite, an iron ore in pellet form, by the ton. Some 26,116 long tons of taconite pellet rattled and roared into her holds that day through the open hatches. But as her crew worked to secure the load and evenly fill the holds, the weather began to turn and a breeze picked up. The storm, being tracked by the National Weather Service, had seen the barometer drop from 29.53 to 29.4 inches of mercury, and it was dropping still. It had swung further north too, now threatening to pass over Lake Superior itself. It lumbered up over Kansas at the speed of a tramcar. Just after 2 p.m, the Fitz had finished loading and her hatches were put back in place and clamped shut. With her steam up, her turbines whined into mechanical life, and the big ship's screw propeller churned the water as it strained to shift the massive weight. Within a few minutes, the ship had steamed out of her dock at Wisconsin, and soon she was managing her maximum speed, that's 14 knots, with her propeller cutting through the water at some 99 revolutions per minute. This was as routine to the ship's crew as could be. Life aboard was happy. She was a comfortable home to them. The food was good, and the quarters were comfortable, luxurious even. Edmund Fitzgerald was underway, but it would prove to be her last departure. Over Iowa, something happened to the storm system. It surged like a fire showered with gasoline. As the barometer dropped to 29.33 inches of mercury, it picked up speed. Winds howled at 38 knots, nearing 44 miles per hour. The National Weather Service issued a gale warning. Waves, they said, would be driven up to 5 or 10 feet high by the next day, but within a few hours they'd raise the height to 15 feet. As it surged north, it picked up speed and intensity, and Edmund Fitzgerald was steaming right for it. Aboard the ship, Captain McSorley was concerned. He was an experienced skipper who knew the lakes very well. Some considered him the best captain on the lakes at all. He'd begun as a deckhand back in 1930, and 13 years later was already in command of his own steamer. That man, one crew member later recalled, could take 729 feet of iron and park between two other ships within 5 feet like you're backing up a pickup truck. The guy was the best. This trip, it was said, was actually going to be Captain McSorley's final before retirement. He'd taken it on as a way to pay for his wife's medical bills back home. But now, in the pilot house of the great ship, he was faced with a conundrum. The storm system was bearing down at speed and threatened to catch him and his men out in mid-lake. Off Two Harbour, Minnesota, another ship had fallen into line with the Fitzgerald. Another ore carrier, the SS Arthur M. Anderson, was bound for Gary, Indiana, and the two ships maintained roughly the same course and speed, separated by about 10 miles. The barometer had continued to plunge throughout the day, so that by nightfall winds howled and both ships were enveloped in spray. After 2 a.m, the skippers had received storm warnings which predicted 50-knot winds. They conferred via VHF radiophone. To maintain course in the established shipping lanes would get them quickest across the lake and out of the storm's path, but it would mean steaming right through the worst of it. Instead, McSorley settled on a different plan, steaming up and buzzing the Canadian coast. He was less familiar with these waters, but Canada's vast landmass should deaden the worst of the northeasterly winds and keep his ship's bow pointing safely into the worst of it. Up they went, and still the storm bore down. By murky dawn the next day, the barometer had dropped to just 29 inches of mercury, and the storm center was meeting Lake Superior at last at Marquette, Michigan. On its course, it was bound to cut across Edmund Fitzgerald's path come nightfall. In the afternoon, at 1:50 p.m, the sky was overcast, the breeze slight at 5 knots, but less than 2 hours later, the Arthur M. Anderson reported 43-knot northwesterly winds, snow and massive waves that broke over her bows and washed green water along her decks. The Fitzgerald had aimed her bow straight at Canada and Michipicoten Island before swinging south to head for Lake Huron and out of harm's way. To get there, she'd have to pass Whitefish Point and enter the bay, where the estuary becomes the St. Mary's River and the Soo Locks provide access further south. The river and the locks meant relative safety, but now came the dash across open Lake Superior. It was only 107 miles, about 173 kilometres. It wouldn't be easy going, and McSorley knew it. By 3:30 p.m, the wind roared and whipped up and down the deck. 2 vent covers, possibly from the ballast tanks, were torn off. A section of railing was dislodged. The Fitzgerald was pummeled by big seas and pelted with rain and ice. Worst of all, her 2 radars were put out of action, and she was steaming blind. McSorley on the Fitzgerald checked in with Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper aboard the Arthur M. Anderson and told him he had his pumps going, ostensibly to drain floodwater from his ship, but the Fitzgerald still had a bad list. McSorley said they were the worst seas he'd ever seen. Then, from shore, came a worrying report. The Soo Locks had been closed, and all ships were advised instead to find shelter anywhere they could. The storm wasn't going anywhere. In fact, it was getting worse. The Weather Service now warned of gusts up to 60 knots, that's 70 miles or 112 kilometers per hour. The storm center had finally reached the 2 ships battling their way south, and by 6 p.m, conditions were dire. Waves rolled in up to 35 feet high, the height of a 3-story building, and they crashed along Edmund Fitzgerald's hull and her decks with a thunderous roar. Inside the long passageways, the tunnels must have rattled and groaned as her 729-foot hull flexed and bent as it crested every wave. It's amazing that ships can take such punishment, but still, she plodded along, checked in regularly with the Arthur M. Anderson to make sure a safe distance was kept between them, and she was heading on the right course. By now, the ships were approaching Whitefish Point, a sandy, tree-lined bit of land that reaches up like a finger pointed toward Canada. The Fitzgerald would have to round it to enter Whitefish Bay and find safe anchorage to ride the storm out. But the ship's radars had been put out of action. Captain McSorley had to rely instead on the Anderson. At around 7 p.m, the two ships swapped navigation details, and the Anderson told McSorley his ship was on track to clear Whitefish Point. The rain pelted down, the seas heaved. The Anderson's mate was about to sign off, but he fired off one final message. "Oh, by the way," he said, "how are you making out with your problems?" "We're holding our own," came the reply from the Fitzgerald. "Okay, fine," said the mate. "I'll be talking to you later." That was 7:10 p.m, and it was the last anybody would ever hear from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Soon, with the worst of the storm passing northward, the snow stopped. Visibility improved. But the Arthur M. Anderson's crew was surprised they couldn't see Edmund Fitzgerald's lights, because she should have been just about 9 miles ahead and well within visible range. Captain Cooper thought the Fitzgerald, with its leaking vents and struggling pumps, must have suffered a blackout. He told his men to keep a keen eye out for a dark silhouette against the horizon. The skipper got to work with his radar, but none of the targets resembled the Fitzgerald at all. Attempts at raising them on the radio were met with static. The big ship had vanished without a trace.
The last time that you talked to him, at what time that was, Louis? I had to check with the mate on it, but it must have been right around 7:15, our time, Eastern Standard Time.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over.
Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way.
Hours after she had disappeared, the US Coast Guard, an American and Canadian merchant ships scoured the lake's surface, and they called desperately out, but there came no response. On the 14th, days after she had disappeared, a US Navy search aircraft using a magnetic detector picked up a single, large contact below the lake's surface. Ominously, an oil slick had stained the water, and it could mean only one thing. The Edmund Fitzgerald was down there. Over the next week, some tragic remnants were pulled from the water. 2 inflatable life rafts, more than 20 fragments of life jackets, an intact but damaged lifeboat, and then the smashed half of another, all empty. No bodies, just pieces of flotsam. Clearly, whatever had happened to the Fitzgerald had happened quickly, and it had been violent. The life rafts were torn, the lifeboats smashed and battered, the life jackets ripped apart. The rest of the flotsam presented a tragic reminder of the lives that had been lost. A wooden stool, a spray bottle marked with the words "Pilot House Window," a floodlight. 29 men went into the lake that night. At least 16 women were widowed. The listed next of kin for the missing makes for tragic reading. Brothers, daughters, parents. They all waited with bated breath for good news that never came. Instead, months later, an underwater survey found their loved one's ship in 2 shattered sections on the lake floor. That May, 12 dives yielded some 43,252 feet of videotape and 895 colour photographs. It showed the once proud ship reduced to a twisted pile of tortured steel protruding from the mud. Today, it's been 50 years since the Edmund Fitzgerald was lost, and we're still left with the same burning question. What on earth happened out there in the storm? Of course, right after the ship was lost, the Great Lakes maritime community and the public needed to know why. Edmund Fitzgerald was a modern, workhorse cargo ship. Her sinking could cast a pall of scrutiny over every other ship on the lakes built to her standard of design. As always, getting to the bottom of what had actually happened was absolutely critical. What followed was months, years really, of investigation and analysis, and it resulted in two main reports. The first is the Coast Guard Marine Board Casualty Report, released in July 1977, about a year and a half after the sinking. The second is by the NTSB, the Maritime Accident Report. It came the next year, in May 1978. Both reports cover similar ground, but the Coast Guard Casualty Report is about 100 pages or so longer. To understand what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, we first need to establish some ground rules. The ship sent her final radio message around 7:10 p.m, but just 10 minutes later, she'd disappeared from radar screens. So in the space of that short amount of time, Edmund Fitzgerald was sunk. It's resulted in a spread of hypotheses, so to figure out what actually happened, we need to make sure that each theory fits within the laws established by the analysis of the events, and most crucially, the actual state of the wreck itself. So first of all, let's establish the list of laws we need our sinking hypothesis to actually stick to. November 10th, the Edmund Fitzgerald was suffering from a list, and she had some topside damage when some vent covers and a railing were taken off around 3:30 p.m. When the ship radioed the Anderson, she further advised she had her pumps running to drain water. By 5 p.m, when the Fitzgerald established radio communication with the Swedish ship Avefors, that had developed into a bad list while the ship was taking heavy seas over the deck, in what was, according to Captain McSorley, one of the worst seas he'd ever been in. The ship's radars were out of commission, so she'd need to rely on the Anderson to be her eyes and her ears. At 7:10 p.m, the ship reports its final status. We are holding our own. Sometime between then and 7:20 p.m, she is lost suddenly. So suddenly, in fact, no distress call is sent. Comparing this timeline to the vessel's track shows us this. Around 1:50 p.m, the ship was 2.5 to 3 miles southwest of Michipicoten Island. By 3:30 p.m, she was some 16 miles ahead of the Anderson, northeast of Caribou Island. This is when she reported that topside damage and the list. By 4:10 p.m, Fitzgerald's radars were down. Around 5:30 p.m, with huge seas washing over her decks, the Fitzgerald is told by the Anderson that she's about here, 35 miles away from Whitefish Point. She informs the Anderson she'll make for a passing some 2.5 miles off the point. At 7:10 p.m, when Fitzgerald makes her last contact, she's here, and that's roughly where her wreckage is found. 46 degrees, 59.9 minutes north, 85 degrees, and 6.6 minutes west. These are the key events that any sinking hypothesis has to play by. But this is just a part of the story, because to really understand what happened to the ship, we need to actually look at the state of the wreck. Fortunately, the reports go into some serious detail about the ship's condition, and it's not a pretty picture. She lies like this, a 276-foot-long bow section, largely intact, sitting almost upright in the mud, pointing to the southeast. 170 feet away, a 253-foot section of stern, intact as well, but upside down, with its keel pointing to the sky towards the northeast. Between the two, a debris field of twisted, crumpled metal and taconite pellets restricted only to a small radius around the broken sections. The bow and the stern sections account for about 3/4 the ship's overall length, but a massive 200-foot-long section of the vessel's middle is almost totally gone. The bow section provides some crucial clues. The ship's steering spar, a small boom attached to the bow that provided crew with a fixed point to visually monitor their ship's direction, is bent in toward the bridge. The pilot house windows are all gone. The bow section ends just aft of cargo hatch number 8. The ship's plating at the starboard side of the hull is twisted inward toward the ship's centerline. The deck plating is bent upward from hatch number 6. The cover from number 1 hatch has been found inside the hatch, and it showed evidence of buckling from external loading. Number 2 hatch cover is missing. Number 3, though mostly buried in mud, appears to be intact. Number 4 is covered. Number 5 is missing. Number 6 has been pushed down inside the hatch, while 7 and 8 are missing as well. Shell plating at the bow is damaged. On the starboard side, just aft of the stem, the very front of the ship, the hull below the spar deck is holed and badly distorted. Further aft, the plating is bent inward and badly wrinkled. The radar and direction-finding antennas were all missing. The stern section, meanwhile, shows intact bottom and side plating, with no damage aside from a small dent forward on the port side and buckling on the starboard side about 20 feet behind the breakup separation. A section of wreckage extends from the stern, likely part of the spar or weather deck, containing other hatch combings. All of the areas of separation show curving, twisting edges associated with ductile fracture, without straight or flat separations common to brittle fracture. We'll explain this in more detail soon. First, we need to talk about hatches and clamps. I know, it sounds fascinating. Just bear with me. The hatches ran stories deep into the 3 cargo holds. A hatch is really just a hole cut into the deck plating to allow the loading and unloading of cargo. The spar deck featured these combings, a steel wall, 24 inches, that's 61 centimeters tall, that permanently surrounded the hatch opening. For the loading and unloading of cargo, the hatch was left open, but once the ship needed to get underway, the cover was installed. This was made of steel plating, 5/16 of an inch, about 8 millimeters thick, and underneath that, around the edges, was a rubber gasket for water tightness, which was 9/16 of an inch, that's 1.4 centimeters thick. To secure the hatch cover, each combing was fitted with 68 of these Kestner-type clamps. Now, much has been made of these clamps, but they were very simple in their function. The crew would swing the clamp up, adjust the bolt's height and seat it in a little divot or button, and then wrench the thing shut on the bottom so the clamp could bite down on the cover and seal the hatch. Simple. Analysis of the wreck revealed some interesting details. All of the hatch combings still have clamps attached. The great majority of them appear to be undamaged. One combing, for example, has a line of undamaged clamps with just one on all 4 sides showing damage. This seemed to create a pattern. Nearly every hatch combing shows some undamaged clamps. This eventually became really important in the investigation. We'll get into that soon. So, this is the rubric that we've made based on the information we have on the chain of events and the conditions of the ship and the wreck. Essentially, it's a rule set that a viable sinking theory needs to adhere to. Think of it like a checklist. We need to tick off every one of these things for our sinking theory to make any sense. I've divided the pertinent conditions we need to meet into different groups. Those on the ship's character and design, the events, the wreck's overall condition, the state of the bow section, and then the state of the stern section. We'll run each major theory up against our rubric and create a kind of weighted scoring system. So the conditions that the theory aligns with, but isn't heavily influenced by, will receive a score of 0. They're just coincidental, right? Conditions which directly support that theory will receive a score of 10. And the conditions that contradict or disagree with the theory will receive -10. It's a simple system, perhaps not totally immune to personal biases, but I will try my best. Against this, we can try to measure all the major theories put forward to try to explain how and why Edmund Fitzgerald was lost. There are 5 main hypotheses that try to explain the cause of the sinking, and first and probably most well known is the structural failure theory. It goes like this. Edmund Fitzgerald is battling its way through the thick of the weather. With the ship listing and the pumps chugging away, Captain McSorley reports in via radio that they are holding their own, with no immediate risk of danger. But then comes a sudden, loud crack like a cannon shot. The ship is being hit by a quartering sea, that is, waves approaching from near to astern or from behind. They increase in size and ferocity, with the ship's hull groaning and straining under the immense weight of 26,000 tons of ore cargo. It becomes too much. With the parting of steel and a shrieking crack, the hull gives way. The 2 halves remain attached to begin with, but the pounding seas force them apart with the sound of rending steel. The bow section begins to flood, and it drops like a stone. It lands upright on the lake bottom. Meanwhile, the stern, with the ship's engines still running, chugs on ahead in a lazy half circle before rolling over and sinking too. It happens so suddenly and violently that no distress call is sent. This theory is not without historical precedent. From the 1940s on, American merchant ships had the nasty habit of cleaving in two. In the Second World War, when metallurgical science was still in its infancy, steel, which today would be considered highly brittle, was pumped out and used in shipbuilding by the ton. The steel contained high sulfur and phosphorus content, with much of it made in acid-lined open hearth furnaces. The result was deck and shell plating that, in the right conditions, especially in the cold and in a storm, was liable to crack like a ceramic dish. It happened time and time again. On the open ocean, back in 1943, the SS John P. Gaines was caught in a storm that cleaved the ship in half. In 1942, the tankers Pendleton and Fort Mercer both broke in half in the same storm. But there's a precedent on the lakes as well. In 1958, it was the Carl D. Bradley, a freighter of similar proportions and layout to the Fitzgerald, although about 30 years older. In a storm with a following sea, she had broken in half and sank. Most dramatic of all, though, was the Daniel J. Morrell 8 years later. Similar again to the Fitzgerald, she too broke her back in a storm, so suddenly that no distress call was sent. Crew, who'd abandoned ship in a raft, spotted the lights of an approaching vessel in the murk, only to realise it was the stern section of their own ship, which had steamed off in a circle under its own power and now bore back down on them. So, had the Edmund Fitzgerald, in a monster sea, simply broken her back and dropped under the full weight of her ore cargo like a stone? Investigators turned to the ship's records for clues, and they did find a history of cracking. In the winter of 1969 to 1970, the ship underwent refit that saw her receive internal stiffening thanks to cracks in the hull. Then another crack was found, this time up top, near to hatch 14. It started in a rivet hole and ran straight up, thought to have been caused by a fault in the ship's original construction. There are some insanely detailed reports on the Fitzgerald's repair history that I found in the National Archives from the last 5 years or so of its operation. I'll include a link to them down in the description. It's very interesting reading. Here's the thing. Cracks aren't totally unusual on big ships. They can come about over years of material fatigue and the concentration of stress on things like seams or rivet holes. What matters most is whether the cracks have the opportunity to propagate, to spread across the hull or deck, to lead to a large overall structural failure. In the Fitzgerald's case, the cracks were routinely welded up and monitored. The two I mentioned above were sealed and observed not to recur. Here's where the hull fracture theory begins to lose momentum. Edmund Fitzgerald was constructed long after the published work of Constance Tipper, the pioneering metallurgist who had examined the brittle steel being used in the construction of ships quite closely. In the 1950s, when the Edmund Fitzgerald was being planned and built, the quality of steel used in ships' hulls had to pass what was known as the Tipper test, a measure of the ductile, brittle transition temperature of the metal. That is to say, the point at which the steel can suddenly shatter in cold temperatures without warning. Edmund Fitzgerald was completed in 1958 and built out of very different stuff to what had gone into the John P. Gaines, the Fort Mercer, the Pendleton, the Bradley and the Morrell. Now we need to turn to our rubric and the evidence that was present during the investigations to measure the hull break theory up. The hull break would explain why there are two halves to the wreck. That's a good start. History has shown that vessels of layouts similar to the Edmund Fitzgerald, with long, slender hulls, may be susceptible to breaking if the seas are big enough, if conditions are just right. The suddenness of a breakup might account for the lack of a distress call. Some ships that broke up didn't send a distress call, some that did break up did. That one's a little bit hard to tell. The sudden large waves reported from the Anderson might have stressed the hull beyond its limits, although the Coast Guard report really seemed to disagree with this. So what can't be explained is how both sections of the ship are only 170 feet apart. If Edmund Fitzgerald had broken up on the surface, then like the Daniel J. Morrell, her stern section would either have continued on by itself because its engines were still running and sunk off on the distance, or been blown away from the bow section by heavy seas. They'd be far more than 170 feet apart. What about the taconite ore pellets? They lie in the river bottom in a very small radius around the wreck. If the stern had broken at the surface, you'd imagine that the ruptured holds, numbers 2 and 3, would have spewed the pellets out in a wild pattern that would have spent them out over a much wild area. Then there's the middle section, the full 200 feet of the Edmund Fitzgerald's hull is simply gone, reduced to piles of twisted and shattered metal. A fracture in the structure here would have seen the ship broken into 2 distinct sections, and all the hull should be accountable, but instead, a little over a quarter of its length is simply missing and totally unrecognisable. Other observations from the wreck seem to throw a wrench in the works as well. The reports all said that all the areas at the separation of the bow and stern, where the ship broke up, show evidence of ductile fracture, so that's from bending and twisting. It's not brittle fracture, the likes of which had happened spontaneously and sunk ships like the Daniel J. Morrell, the John P. Gaines, so we probably can't put this down to quality of metal or, the steel actually used in the ship's construction. Then there's the spar and the weather deck. At the bow, the damage to that deck and its hatches is shown to get more severe moving backwards towards the breakup zone, with some hatch covers missing, presumably blown outwards by escaping air as the ship sank. And then towards the bow, others have seemed to collapse inward. If the bow section had broken away and sunk by itself, then we'd expect probably to see more damage the further toward the bow you get, where the air in the holds and the forward tanks and things would have been trapped and unable to escape. Hatch 1, which would have been the last to submerge, should have probably been blown out by all that escaping air, but instead it's been smashed inward by external crush loading. Lastly, analysis done on the waveforms and the sizes encountered by the Fitzgerald that night supposedly showed that, according to the reports, stress levels from the longitudinal bending moments were well below that which would cause a structural failure on the surface. I have never seen or been able to track down the actual specifics of that report, so take that for what it's worth, but that's the conclusion that the Coast Guard came to. All up, this seems to give the surface structural failure theory a paltry weighted score of -20. If not a surface breakup, then what? Well, reports from the Arthur M. Anderson on the night of the sinking seem to provide a tantalising clue. Just before the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared, the Anderson was struck suddenly by massive seas. 2 or perhaps 3 big waves swept over the deck and reared up to an estimated 25 to 35 feet. Rogue waves are formed when 2, 3 or more waves merge as one thanks to high winds or converging currents. The Great Lakes are notorious for it. Bounded on all sides by shore, the lakes could be extremely choppy with shorter, taller waveforms than those found out on the open ocean. Researchers on the lakes, Professor Chin Wu and research assistant John Anderson, studied rogue waves on the lakes by using instruments to measure currents and waves in Lake Superior. Early results showed an increased probability of rogue waves near what were called reflecting walls. Think of it like splashing in a bathtub. It takes very little effort to create a turbulent surface because the waves bounce off each other and the tub's sides. They group together, said Anderson, during certain wave conditions. You might get 3 or 4 in an hour, and then you won't get one for the rest of the day. That exact scenario, one big wave followed quickly by 2 more, has even earned a nickname on the lakes, the Three Sisters, and it's ominously close to what the crew aboard the Arthur M. Anderson experienced that night. Edmund Fitzgerald, with her list to starboard, could have encountered the first big wave, which swept clean over the deck. That would have sent her down into the trough, but before she could come back up, the second wave kept her down. Then the third, if there was one, would finish her off, submerging her and allowing her cargo hatches, rated only to a depth of 4 feet, to collapse or pop away. The ship would simply sink and never resurface. On the rubric, a rogue wave flooding event scores very highly. It would have happened suddenly, sending the ship down like a submarine, popping the pilot house windows all at once, wrenching off the ship's antennas and preventing that distress call. The sudden weight of water over the deck would be too much, probably, for the cargo hatches to handle. They'd have buckled inwards, and it would explain why the covers and the coamings from hatches 1, 3, 5, and 6 show evidence of having been smashed in from above, and why damage to the coamings and the hatches got worse sequentially as more and more of them failed, one after another. It explains how the radar and the antennas were swept suddenly away. That immersion potentially caused the bow's shell plating and coamings on deck to buckle inward under the sheer pressure. The sudden force subjected to the ship may have even bent the steering spar back towards the bridge. It takes a lot of force to do something like that. The rogue wave theory fits in well with the rubric, with no contradictory points. An important point though, it does essentially render other key events like the earlier topside damage, the flooding, and that starboard list moot. They're simply coincidental in this theory. It was wave action and wave action alone that suddenly swamped and overwhelmed the ship. Although some flooding in the ballast tanks might have made her more susceptible to a rogue wave strike, it's not the focal point of this theory. So all up, it gives us a weighted score of 120. The shoaling theory dictates that Edmund Fitzgerald had unknowingly shoaled or run aground earlier that day, hours before the sinking when she passed Caribou Island. Here, the lake is shallow, just 36 feet, and Edmund Fitzgerald's draft was 27. The crew of the Anderson reported Edmund Fitzgerald had passed close to this point. Too close, perhaps, around 3:20 p.m. This is ominously close to the time Captain McSorley reported what has since been deemed that topside damage, a downed fence rail and damaged vent covers on the spar deck. It's considered possible, reads the Coast Guard report, that a light grounding or near grounding on these shoals could have occurred. A survey in 1976 found that the shoals actually ran farther east by as much as a mile, dangerously close to the Edmund Fitzgerald's estimated track. A grounding like this would put pressure on the hull and cause it to flex suddenly. The vibration and hull movement could have displaced the fence rail and brought it down. What happened next, though, is a source of divergence in the theory. The first version suggests that the ship began to flood at this point, with the hull ruptured below the waterline, causing her to list to starboard, wallow in the waves, losing a battle with buoyancy until she simply sank. The second variation of the hypothesis was put forward by a mechanical engineer professor from Michigan Tech. He suggests that the grounding event was so severe, it weakened the hull, so that the constant wave action caused the middle section, that 200-foot-long section, to simply drop out in one unit. On the rubric, the shoaling theory comes up against some challenges. Plating on the upturned stern section shows no evidence of dragging or grounding. It's perfectly intact. Now, this is particularly telling because the ship's trim at the time of her departure was about 4 inches lower further aft, meaning that the stern of the ship was riding slightly lower in the water. Now, contact with the lake bottom at the shoal would surely have involved the stern and its casting dragging over the top, especially an impact as heavy as that suggested by the shoaling theory's proponents. It's hard to imagine how only the bow and the midship section of the ship could be damaged and not the stern. As for the theory of the central hull failing, it encounters the same issues as the other surface fracture theory. Taconite pellets would have rained down over a wide vicinity. The stern section and the bow, once separated, would have drifted much further apart. That, and if the hull's central section had failed as one piece and fallen intact, it would likely still be on the riverbed in one piece. But it's not. The hull's middle section has been reduced to shredded nothingness. All of this combined gives us a score of 0 for the first version of the theory, and -20 for the version involving the surface breakup. The fourth theory, the topside damage theory, is simple enough. It suggests that the damage sustained by the Edmund Fitzgerald around 3:20 p.m. was from something striking the ship, either an object on the lake or something having broken free from the ship itself. This unknown object could have struck the bow. It corresponds with plating damage on the starboard side, perhaps, and caused flooding of the ballast tanks for sure, but perhaps, critically, somehow of the cargo holds. But what exactly might be big enough floating around the lake to strike the ship that could puncture multiple layers of steel hull plating and bulkheads? Not only that, the object, in order to cause the serious flooding reported, would have needed to have struck twice with serious force. First, at the bow of the ship, where it would have needed to have opened up the plating like the iceberg did to Titanic. Then it would have needed to carry over the deck to sweep along, take off 2 vent covers and the fence rail, before disappearing over the side. It's difficult to imagine just what could have done this. On the rubric, the theory steers clear of the other surface breakup-related pitfalls. Flooding caused by topside damage does account for the list and that reported damage. But if something hit Edmund Fitzgerald heavily enough that it could actually hole the bow plating, why did McSorley not say anything more seriously about it? Not only that, if the ship's bow section was flooding unchecked with the pumps draining water only from the ballast tanks, surely it would have sunk much sooner than it actually did. But most damning of all, and it's not really something covered by the rubric here, but for me it's a real nail in the coffin. What on earth, floating on the lake's surface, would have sufficient mass to smash in hull plating and cause flooding anyway? To me, this theory gives a weighted score of about 30. Finally, we come to what is called the gradual flooding hypothesis, and for this, we need to look Not at the Edmund Fitzgerald, but we'll start with another dramatic wreck that happened just 5 years later, the MV Derbyshire. Derbyshire was a combination ship designed to carry a mix of both wet or dry cargoes from ore to oil. Similarly to the Edmund Fitzgerald, although of a completely different design, being an ocean-going ship, she featured a single weather deck with a long row of cargo hatches with covers, 9 in total, with her hull sides and bottom protected by ballast and trim tanks. In September 1980, the ship was hove to in a monster typhoon off Japan, doing her best simply to ride out the frightening waves. In her holds were some 157,000 tons of iron ore. Force 11 winds drove the seas up to 35 feet. She last reported she was waiting the storm out, but then she simply disappeared. No distress call was sent, and the massive ship had gone. If this sounds familiar, then it's no surprise. Derbyshire bears some striking resemblance to the Fitzgerald's loss some 5 years before, although I haven't really seen them spoken about often in the same sentence. That's a shame though, because I think the Derbyshire's sinking and the reports and analysis done on it can go a long way to explain what happened to Edmund Fitzgerald. Here's the short of it. Derbyshire was crawling along at 1.5 or 2 knots, being pummeled by enormous waves that washed green water over her deck. As the waves grew in height and ferocity, the ship was experiencing serious pitching up and down, dropping her head into troughs only to cop another big wave right over the bow. The green water carried serious weight. It smashed along, taking off vent covers and sending water cascading down into voids in the bow. The tanks and the stores down there were cavernous. As Derbyshire ploughed on, she was fighting a slow, losing battle, and her crew didn't even know it. Without any warning, the ship, which had slowly ridden lower and lower in the water, so slowly that it was imperceptible from the bridge, dropped into a wave trough, like she'd done hundreds of times before. Only she didn't come back up. This time, so low in the water as she was, the weight of a wave over her weather deck was too much. It caved in 1 or 2 of her forward cargo hatch covers. The sudden inrush of hundreds, even thousands of tons of water, tipped the balance. Derbyshire lost her fight for buoyancy. She simply plunged into a wave like a submarine and never came back up. So, back to the Edmund Fitzgerald. If she'd been sinking slowly over time, so slowly that, like Derbyshire, her crew had failed to notice her ride lower and lower in the water, she too could have suddenly lost her battle and plunged below under the weight of her cargo. But how? Most of Fitzgerald's vents reached down only into the ballast tanks. The pumps were designed to handle water that was accumulating down there. But the cargo holds were different. Those massive spaces were loaded with the taconite or pellets. In a way, they were the Fitzgerald's Achilles heel. Her voluminous 3 holds were really actually just 1 hold separated into 3 by screening bulkheads that were basically steel walls designed to support the weight of the iron ore and separate the load into 3 distinct loads, but not to provide watertight subdivision. If the hold was opened to the lake or flooded, there could be nothing to stop the ship from sinking. So that's why it was protected so by the ballast tanks from below and to the side. But a watertight ship, it's like a box. It needs to be watertight on every side. What about from above? Well, remember when we talked about hatches, clamps, and coamings? Here's why. Each of the 21 hatches had a cover on top of its coaming. Each coaming was fitted with 68 clamps, which bit down on the cover, forcing the rubber gasket against the coaming and creating a seal. The state of the clamps on the wreck presents us with some troubling conflicting evidence. Analysis of the wreck showed that even though the hatch covers had collapsed or been blasted off, many of the clamps seemed to be just fine, swinging happily from the coamings almost like new. The thought at the time was that if they'd been fastened and secured down when the ship sank, the force of the detaching hatch covers would have blasted the clamps off, bending or twisting them all out of shape. Instead, some coamings showed only 1 damaged clamp on all 4 sides, and it seemed to investigators to show that only a handful of clamps of those 68 had ever actually been used. This is the troubling bit. Edmund Fitzgerald's crews were experienced lakes sailors. They knew their work very well. Their skipper, McSorley, was a wet weather captain. He was a master known for driving his ship through the worst that the lakes could throw at him. It seems impossible to believe that the crew, steaming right for a gale, would fail to fasten all of their cargo hatches. Photographs of the Fitzgerald in service often show many of the clamps unfastened. Sometimes it's just the corners, with one or two done up towards the cover's middle. But this is almost always the case in fine weather only. Although the hatches were fitted with 68 of the things, there was no general guideline on how many to shut. The crews just operated as they saw fit for the conditions. In rough weather, however, things were different. Photographs of the ship in big seas show all of the clamps done up instead. I personally find it hard to believe that with the hours of preparation before meeting the storm, time enough for McSorley, for example, to prepare to alter course, something completely out of character for him, that the crew could overlook this critical point. And yet, there they are on the wreck, undamaged, clamps swinging freely. It's another great Edmund Fitzgerald mystery. But I suggest we err on the side of the men who knew their work better than I, and better than most people who study the story of the Fitzgerald. The mathematics seem to suggest something disturbing. If just one hatch cover failed, or dislodged, or had an unnoticed flaw, it could have been enough to doom the ship. Titanic, a 45,000 gross registered ton passenger liner, was sunk in a little over 2 hours by damage that could only have opened up about 12 square feet of her hull. And yet, each of the Fitzgerald's 21 hatch openings represented a void in the hull of about 600 square feet. If just one of those hatches was allowing water somehow into hold number 1 without the crew's knowledge, it could have slowly doomed them. Let's actually look at the clamps and how they work in some detail. These things are beefy, cast iron with a brass bolt at the top and welded to the coamings. They're heavy duty. Once they're attached, they're not going anywhere. A friend of the channel's who works on a Great Lakes freighter today sent us this video demonstrating the way they operate. It's simple as pie. They just swing upward, the bolt fits into that little divot, and once wrenched into place at the bottom, it's not going anywhere. The pounding waves are unlikely to have shifted any of these clamps. But that's not all. It's not an uncommon occurrence for hatch covers to be lifted off accidentally before some of the clamps have been unfastened. In some cases, because of the immense and sudden forces, the hatch covers fail and buckle long before the clamps do. Much has been made of the Edmund Fitzgerald's hatches, coamings, and clamps, but for the men and women who actually work on Lakers and use this machinery from day to day, the equipment seems sound, reliable, and even to some extent, over-engineered. For its part, the Coast Guard report found this. It said, a detailed analysis of the amount of water that could have entered the cargo holds through openings between the hatch covers and the hatch coamings of the Fitzgerald was made by both the Coast Guard and the Safety Board. Both analyses show that the current hatch design used on Great Lakes vessels, which, by the way, is still in service today, would have permitted significant amounts of water to enter the Fitzgerald's cargo hold under the sea conditions encountered. Now, I haven't been able to find any of the details of this detailed analysis, but it's kind of hard to imagine how the hatches and their coamings, being watertight as they are, could have allowed so much water ingress as to doom the ship over time. Something else has to have happened. So, Edmund Fitzgerald's cargo hold, its vast Achilles heel, is sealed from above by hatch covers and coamings and protected from the sides and below by vast ballast tanks. Her crew know their ship and the lakes well, and they've clamped the hatches shut. How then could the ship have flooded enough to be overwhelmed by the storm? Well, we need to turn our attention back to that infamous topside damage incurred earlier in the afternoon. Edmund Fitzgerald featured mushroom vents, so called because of their shape. They were about 8 inches or 20 centimetres tall for the ballast tank vents, and 30 inches at 76 centimetres tall for those for the crew tunnels. The mushroom vents' bulbous tops can be screwed shut to essentially create a watertight seal. But should the top come off in a big sea, then it would be exposed to the lake. Each of the mushroom vents was about 8 inches wide, that's 20 centimetres, representing an opening in the hull of about 0.35 square feet. With waves washing over the deck, it's not impossible that a handful could have had their tops torn off. Now, 0.35 square feet doesn't sound like much, but that's just one vent. Edmund Fitzgerald had at least around 46 of the things, 2 for each hatch and 4 for the tunnels. In total, that's about 16 square feet of potential opening. For comparison, Titanic was a 45,000-ton passenger ship which had sunk in about just over 2 hours, with 12 square feet of her hull having been opened to the ocean. We know that 1 or 2 of the Fitz's vents had been damaged that afternoon. On the wreck, one of the vents near hatch 5 has been completely torn away. What about all the others? All it would take is for the Fitzgerald to ride low in the water, low enough for waves to break over her deck repeatedly. A change to her loading just 2 years earlier, in 1973, provided exactly these conditions. That year, the ship was allowed by the Coast Guard to ride some 3 foot, 3¼ inches lower than she had done as built. It doesn't sound like a huge change. It's only a metre. But the Coast Guard report states this significantly reduced the ship's buoyancy and allowed big seas to regularly wash over the deck. This perfect storm scenario saw all the conditions working against the Fitz's crew that night. Their ship already rode lower and deeper in the lake water because of the new loading. With waves being whipped up to towering heights by the screaming winds, the ship's spar deck was pummeled with spray and green water. The mushroom vents took the brunt of the force. If some began to fail, then water would roar down into the cavernous ballast tanks, maybe even the crew tunnels, and bring the ship down lower and lower into the water. Something like this seemed to have happened quite recently too. Just last year, in fact, in June 2024, a Great Lakes freighter, the Michipicoten, was underway on Lake Superior when the crew heard a loud bang and the ship began to list. Her hull suddenly developed a large crack, 4 meters or 13 feet long, and it allowed a sudden flooding, and the ship had to be evacuated for fear she may capsize under her load of taconite. She listed at 15 degrees, but her crew was eventually able to bring her back to 5. Now that was on something like a flat calm too. Imagine if something like this had happened in a roaring storm. The Michipicoten is designed very similarly to the Fitzgerald, with her big ballast tanks surrounding the holds. Clearly, flooding of the tanks can have some serious consequences if it's not dealt with by the pumps. But here is where another design deficiency rears its ugly head. The Fitzgerald wasn't fitted with a gauge measuring her trim or list. Captain McSorley was robbed of a critical piece of information that night. Any detection of a downwards angle would need to have been made visually, but as hour after hour passed and the trim increased imperceptibly, he wouldn't have been able to tell. Every breaking wave, every wash along the deck would have robbed the Fitzgerald of that little bit of critical buoyancy. She was in a fight for her life, a fight to merely stay afloat. A single ruptured tank, a single leak, would see the cargo hold flooding gradually as well. But there was nothing to tell them if the cargo hold was flooding at all, nothing to tell them the ship was riding lower and heavier in the waves. Like the Derbyshire, Edmund Fitzgerald was on the edge of a precipice around 7:10 p.m. that November 10th. All it took was a coup de grace, a final tipping point. It could have come from a big wave, maybe one of the waves the Anderson had reported. It didn't need to be a rogue wave, just one big enough to sweep along the deck. The Fitzgerald's bow would have plunged deep, just like it had done hundreds of times before, only this time, it didn't come back up. The fight had been lost. The combined weight of ton upon ton of water and iron ore held her nose down, and then, when she was about to come up, there would have come a shuddering blow. The cargo hatches begin to collapse. Number 1 fails first. It falls inward and allows even more water to roar in and begin to fill the number 1 cargo hold. After that, there was no coming back. Like a torpedo aimed at the river bottom, Edmund Fitzgerald dropped, and there could be no distress call. On our rubric, this explains the flooding and the list reported by McSorley earlier in the day. It explains the suddenness of the sinking, why the bridge windows have all popped from that sudden flooding, why hatch covers immersed immediately and water failed and buckled inward under the sheer weight, why the antennas were washed away from up top. It gives us a score of 130. Now look, this kind of scoring method, it's an interesting thought experiment. It kind of is designed to echo how some investigations and reports will assign probability ratings to different causes in disasters. The truth is this: we probably will never actually know what really sank Edmund Fitzgerald. But for my money, as a maritime history and engineering researcher, this seems like the most likely scenario. It seems to take every bit of evidence into account and explains why and how the ship was overwhelmed by the storm, through no fault of its crew, but through the sheer force of Mother Nature's fury. But that's not actually the end of the story. Nothing of the rogue wave or the flooding theory explains the strange state of the wreck. 2 intact sections so close together, 200 feet of the middle simply disintegrated. What on earth happened? Well, for this level of devastation, we need to turn back to the Derbyshire and the disturbing report that explains her final moments. After Derbyshire had disappeared, an extensive search and rescue mission managed only to find the mangled remains of 1 lifeboat, and the ship would have remained missing forever. But well over a decade later, in 1994, the Derbyshire Family Association raised enough funds through an organisation called the the International Transport Workers Federation to mount a survey to find and document the wreck. This is pretty extraordinary, because they did so out of sheer frustration with the British Department of Transport, who'd put out a pretty pathetic final report after 9 years, which found simply that the ship had been overwhelmed by the typhoon. Yes, shocking, I know. The survey found Derbyshire, and it was supplemented by future expeditions which took hundreds of thousands of detailed photos of the ship. And what they found was simply horrifying. Derbyshire wasn't intact. It, in fact, was barely even recognisable as a ship. The entire vessel, from the bow down, had been simply shattered. It looked more like an airplane crash site. She had descended down some 4,000 metres or 2.5 miles to the bottom, and essentially the only recognisable part of the ship was her bow and her forecastle. The rest of the ship was reduced to twisted, shattered fragments of steel. It was a terrifying realisation. The forces required to rip a ship apart like this are honestly difficult for us to imagine. An independent report from 1998 explains how it happened, what the report calls implosion-explosion mechanics. Simply put, Derbyshire had dropped into a wave and not recovered. Some of her hatch covers had collapsed and her holes were filling. But as she dropped deeper, her hull was put under some incredible stresses. The report says this: like all double-skinned or bulk oil ships, Derbyshire had many empty void spaces. Her hatch covers would burst at the very early stage of sinking, and the void spaces would be squeezed until, at pressure, their weakest surface would collapse inward, compressing the air to some higher pressure like a spring. This internal air then explodes outward, causing the devastation seen in the wreckage. The second bubble migration phase immediately follows, in which the expanding air escapes as a bubble, or bubbles, which, in bursting out, will oscillate in volume and then continue the damaging process. Any structure in its way, or to which it is attracted, can receive successive expanding bubble pressure thumps, which have been known to permanently deform the shell plating of submarines, for example. This phase, therefore, continues to tear open the structure in a more ductile manner. The report comes to 3 main conclusions on the implosion of big ships like this, right? Number 1, any compartment which has imploded must of necessity have been intact at the time of the sinking. Number 2, conversely, any compartment found fairly intact will have been completely or nearly completely flooded before sinking, or will have been flooded in the early stages of the sinking before reaching its implosion depth. If an incomplete compartment has more or less kept its shape, then there must have been a rent or break in the structure which has permitted flooding at depths less than the implosion depth. Number 3, if a hull has separated into 2 parts before sinking, it's most unlikely that the 2 parts will then sink simultaneously. Therefore, it's nearly certain that the 2 parts will lie far apart on the seabed. There is then a less certain expectation that the time needed for the sea to destroy watertight integrity will allow a partial flooding above implosion depth, and consequently to less extensive implosion-explosion damage of the wreck. As she dropped down, like a chain reaction, hold after hold had shattered, its void tanks blasting apart. The Derbyshire report outlines in depth exactly what kind of force the ship was exposed to. Just one wing ballast tank would release, under implosion, the equivalent of 630 megajoules. That's 218 kilograms, 480 pounds of TNT. Now, let's look at Edmund Fitzgerald's wreck again. Roughly 200 feet from the ship's middle is basically missing or unrecognisable. That's the break from the stern section here at about frame 155, and from just abaft of hatch number 8 on the bow section here. That corresponds with almost the entirety of hold number 2 and nearly half of number 3, as well as about half of the big ballast tanks that sat outboard of the holds themselves. The holds weren't watertight. The ship's cavernous interior was divided by those 2 screen bulkheads designed purely to break up the cargo load into 3 more manageable groups, but the ship's ballast tanks were watertight, and they were simply enormous. They would protect the ship from side damage in a collision or grounding from below, but like Derbyshire, they could also have become a catalyst for the ship's massive destruction. For its part, the report on Derbyshire makes a link with the Fitzgerald when it says this: the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald poses a challenge to a marine forensic analysis. The bow is upright and in good condition on the seabed, while the stern is upside down and intact. The centre section shows extensive implosion-explosion damage. What could have happened? It appears that the stern section capsized during the sinking process due to the fact that 75 feet of her spar deck was still attached. The wreckage of the Derbyshire offers us another look at the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald and what her last moments above the surface might have been. Now we have all the evidence we need to retrace those critical final hours and minutes on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Armed with analysis of the wreck, the official reports and the timeline, our weighted rubric of likely scenarios, and an eerily similar sinking just 5 years later, we'll turn back the clock and find out what might have happened to the mighty Fitz. Edmund Fitzgerald calls Anderson and reports 2 vent covers have been lost or damaged, and a fence rail is down. When asked about his pumps, McSorley says yes, both of them are on, but the Edmund Fitzgerald had 6 pumps in total. Either McSorley was using just his 2,000 gallon per minute units, his auxiliaries, or when he said both of them, he meant that both types of pump were being used. That included his 7,000 gallon per minute main pumps. Anderson's crew just assumed this to mean his ballast tank vents had been lost. The pumps are chugging away. They should be easily able to handle any flooding from above, but they rely on constant water pressure to work. With the ship listing, rolling, and pitching so badly, the pump's inlet is lifted again and again out of the water, stopping the pumps from working effectively. The ballast tanks in the tunnels have taken on water. This alone cannot sink the ship, but more and more of the vents become immersed. Some fail. Every cascade of water down into the tanks and the tunnels robs Edmund Fitzgerald of critical buoyancy. Worse still, a single cracked tank and leak into the cargo hold would allow water to gather there by the ton, water which couldn't be drained. For hours and hours, the ship is pummeled by enormous seas, the bow swinging up and down, the quartering seas from behind piling up at the ship's forward end. Each wave that breaks over the Fitzgerald's weather deck sends water cascading down into the tanks. The pumps sputter and do their best to keep up. Captain McSorley is imbued with a false sense of security. His pumps should be able to handle the water coming into his ballast tanks from the vent covers, he thinks. But still, imperceptibly, Edmund Fitzgerald's bow sinks deeper into the water so the seas wash over her deck and the ship loses her will to fight the lake. Perhaps the rate of flooding seemed manageable. Readings could be taken of the ballast tank's levels, after all. It can't have been too alarming, or McSorley would ring out an SOS. But the old wet weather captain battles on best he can. Whitefish Bay is right there. It's tantalizingly close. If they could just hold on another short while. Maybe, meanwhile, just maybe, a leak into hold number 1, which cannot be tracked or monitored, is what is beginning to tip the scales firmly against the Fitz. The forward holds 1 and 2 drained water aft through sluices fitted in the lower portions of the screen bulkheads to a suction well back in hold 3. Any ballast pump could be used to drain that hole for the purpose, but experience showed that iron ore made drainage extremely difficult. That's not all. The Derbyshire report found that it was postulated that through damaged coamings or seals, it was possible that the top layer of ore in the hold could become saturated and mobile. Around 5 PM came another radio message from the Edmund Fitzgerald, where Captain McSorley mentioned a vent, and then in the background a bad list, and taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he'd ever been in. In the Fitzgerald's number 1 hold, the saturated top layer of taconite slops to the starboard side because of a free surface effect that creates a permanent list and makes the ship's stability only worse, possibly confounding McSorley, who still thinks the list is from the flooding alone through the damaged vents. In reality, the list is a subtle clue that his hold may be also filling with water from a leak, and the taconite is reacting to it. The ship's bow is dropping lower and lower into the waves, almost imperceptibly. McSorley may have thought the waves were bigger than they actually were because his vessel's freeboard was being exhausted and lessened with every minute. At 7:10 PM, the Anderson calls Fitzgerald, inquires on the problems, and then came the response, "We are holding our own," and it was the Fitzgerald's last message. The list is exacerbated by the mobile iron ore as it becomes saturated from water leaking into the hold, sloshing over to starboard. This would mean the list would be stable and permanent, perhaps giving the impression that the flooding wasn't worsening and it was being dealt with by the pumps. It was consistent. Edmund Fitzgerald is at a tipping point. Buoyancy lost in the bow from number 1 cargo hold means that a significant wave form could rob the ship of her ability to recover. The Anderson is hit by two 30 to 35 foot seas at about 6:30 p.m, one burying the aft cabins and damaging a lifeboat by pushing it right down onto the saddle. The second wave of this size, perhaps 35 foot, came over the bridge deck. This happened suddenly to the Fitzgerald after 7:10 p.m. A large wave sees the ship crest and then drop into the trough, but she doesn't come back up. With forward buoyancy exhausted, 26,000 tons of deadweight behind her, the Fitzgerald's bow submerges. She goes down like a submarine, suddenly, so quickly that the pilot house windows implode completely. The radio antennas are wrenched off by the sudden force of water over the bow. The massive water weight sees the ship's bow wallow below the surface on the tipping point of rising again, but then the forward cargo hatches fail under the immense pressure, with some collapsing under the weight of the water. Now, there can be no hope of recovery. The ship is caught, like Derbyshire, in a horrifying chain reaction. Hatch after hatch fails, and the holds begin to rapidly flood. The list to starboard sees the ship's bow strike the bottom on that side, creating plate damage and smashing the steering jib up towards the pilot house. But the stern is still buoyant, and the ship has essentially become like a giant lever. Her cargo holds aren't watertight, they flood quickly, but her massive ballast tanks are. All of a sudden, they begin to implode and shatter with enormous force. The explosive power of hundreds of tons of TNT is released along the ship's midsection. 200 feet of hull simply disintegrates, bit after bit, while the stern is still at or near the surface. It's spared the effects of the implosive damage because now it has the chance to flood more evenly and gradually. Perhaps as much as 75 feet of the spar deck and perhaps more of the midship section remains attached, acting like a sea anchor and pulling the stern down towards the bow. As it goes, it rolls over onto its back and lands with an enormous thud upside down on the lake bottom. The bow had detached from the midship sections as they failed, and it settled upright on the bottom because of the hydrodynamic curves. Hull plating at the bow has tin-canned inward because the forward tanks and the voids there weren't fully flooded yet either, but air roars out of ruptures in seams in the shell near to the stem. It's happened in only minutes. From above, on the lake's surface, over the roar of the waves and the wind, would have come the thunderous boom as the ship broke up, and then nothing. At 7:20 p.m, the Anderson checks her radar, but Fitzgerald is gone. A great man once wrote, and all that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters. This is true of every maritime disaster where crews have faced the wrath of the ocean or the lake at its worst. I've said before on this channel that humanity's struggle with the ocean, to travel across it for commerce, migration, exploration, or even to do battle, it's the greatest underdog tale of our planet's history. We are the underdog. Even with all of our brilliance, our understanding, our capacity for ingenuity, at sea or on the lakes, we are all at the mercy of something much greater and more powerful than ourselves. Many of the Fitzgerald's crew should still be alive today. Their families sure are. They've had to live not only with the loss of their dads, their uncles, husbands and boyfriends, but also with the looming legacy of the ship's loss. They've been told by investigations and supposed experts that the Fitzgerald was lost because their loved ones failed to clamp the hatches shut, completely ignoring the men's actual experience, their knowledge of the lakes and their vessel. The same was true of the Derbyshire. Initial reports were quick to blame the crew for failing to dog a hatch down and shut, when the subsequent analysis showed instead that the vessel's vent covers had blown off and she'd been flooding completely without the crew's knowledge. All too often, the victims of the disaster are blamed by reports quick to jump to conclusions, and it's the families that have to live with it. The Edmund Fitzgerald story still grips us 50 years later, perhaps because we can imagine ourselves there, the frozen terror in those final moments as the ship succumbed, that last message, we are holding our own. As a species, we like to think we're in control, but in reality, we're just doing our best. Now look, only a fool could try to say for certain what happened that night. Debate will rage for decades to come. We have clues, reports, analysis, timelines, but at the end of the day, all we can do is hypothesize. The New York Times said it was the mother of one of the Fitzgerald's young deckhands, Bruce Hudson, who said something like, 30 no, 29 men and God, and nobody's talking. It's a great quote. This video is my theory, based on the evidence at hand, but to be entirely honest with you, debating the point almost feels callous, because the loss of ships like the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Derbyshire, they're human stories, and all that's left behind are the families and the cherished memories of the loved ones they've lost. 50 years later, the men of the Edmund Fitzgerald are remembered dearly, not just by their community, but by the entire world. Their story, unfortunately, isn't totally unique. In our battle against the elements, countless ships and their crews have gone into the abyss. The Derbyshire, the John P. Gaines, the Carl D. Bradley, the Daniel J. Morrell. They set out with their crews hoping for the best, but they were subjected instead to the worst. Hopefully, it's the lessons taken from their loss, understanding how and why, that can only help prevent these tragedies from happening again into the future.